The silk veil felt like a burial shroud against Seraphine's face, each shallow breath pulling the delicate fabric closer to her lips as she stood at the altar of St. Catherine's Cathedral, her trembling fingers clutching a bouquet of white roses she hadn't chosen, wearing a dress she'd never dreamed of, about to marry a man she'd never met. The cathedral was suffocatingly grand, all vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast fractured rainbow light across the marble floors, and she could feel the weight of 300 eyes boring into her back, the combined gaze of 2 crime families waiting to seal an alliance with her body as the treaty. Her heart hammered against her ribcage so violently, she wondered if the man standing beside her could hear it. This infamous Cale Raventhorn, the youngest Mafia boss in New York's history. A man whose name was whispered in the same breath as words like ruthless, deadly, and untouchable. She'd heard he was handsome in that dangerous way that made smart women stupid, but she couldn't see him through the thick veil her father had insisted upon. The kind of veil that belonged to another century, designed to hide rather than adorn. The priest's voice droned on in Latin, words that should have felt sacred, but instead felt like a sentencing, and Seraphine's mind drifted to the girl who was supposed to be standing here instead of her older sister Isolde, the beautiful one, the perfect one, the daughter their father, Vincenzo Ashford, had groomed since birth to be the bridge between the Ashford and Raventhorn families. Isolde, with her porcelain skin and symmetrical features. Isolde, who'd known about this arranged marriage for 2 years and had accepted it with the grace expected of a Mafia princess. Isolde, who 3 days ago had run away in the night with the family driver, leaving nothing but a note that said, "I'm sorry, but I choose love," and condemning Seraphine to take her place. Seraphine had always been the invisible daughter, the one with the jagged scar running from her left temple down to her jaw, a permanent reminder of the car accident that had killed her mother when she was 7. The scar that made her father look away whenever he was forced to acknowledge her existence. The scar that had convinced her she'd never marry at all, much less marry into royalty of the criminal underworld. When her father had come to her room 72 hours ago, with eyes like flint, and told her she would be taking Isolde's place, Seraphine had laughed, actually laughed, because the alternative was screaming. "He's seen photographs of Isolde," she'd said, her hand instinctively moving to trace the familiar ridge of damaged tissue on her face. "He'll never accept me." Her father had leaned in close, his cologne expensive and his breath laced with whiskey, and said in a voice that brokered no argument, "The Raventhorns need this alliance as much as we do. Wars are expensive, and we've been bleeding territory to the Cortez family for 6 months. Kyle Raventhorn will marry an Ashford daughter, or we all die. And since Isolde decided to be selfish, that Ashford daughter is you." Then he'd added the detail that had been echoing in Seraphine's mind ever since. The reason for the ridiculously opaque veil. The reason she was a mystery package being delivered to the altar. "He doesn't know about the switch. We'll tell him after the ceremony is complete, and the marriage is legal. Once it's done, he'll have no choice but to accept it." The priest asked Cale something in English now, pulling Seraphine back to the present moment, and she heard a voice respond beside her, a voice like whiskey and smoke, deep and controlled. "I do." 2 simple words that somehow sounded like a threat and a promise wrapped together, and Seraphine felt her knees weaken, because this was really happening. She was really being tied to a stranger through deception. Starting a marriage with a lie that hung between them like a ghost he couldn't see yet. She tried to imagine his reaction when he lifted the veil, tried to prepare herself for the disgust that would surely flood his features when he saw what he'd actually gotten instead of Isolde's beauty. And something inside her chest cracked, because even though she'd long ago accepted that she wasn't the daughter anyone wanted, having it confirmed in front of 300 witnesses was going to be a special kind of humiliation. The priest turned to her and asked if she took Kyle Raventhorn to be her lawfully wedded husband, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do them part. And Seraphine opened her mouth, but no sound came out, because how could she agree to this? How could she say yes to a fraud that would trap them both? And she felt her father's presence in the front pew like a weapon aimed at her spine, and she knew with absolute certainty that refusing wasn't an option. Her father would rather kill her himself than let this alliance crumble. "I do," she whispered, and her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted, belonging to someone else entirely. "You may now kiss the bride," the priest announced, and Seraphine's entire body went rigid because this was it. This was the moment when everything would shatter, and she felt Cale's hands reach for her veil. Strong hands with long fingers that moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. Time seemed to slow down as he grasped the edges of the silk, and Seraphine closed her eyes behind the veil like a coward, unable to watch his face transform from anticipation to disappointment, unable to bear witness to the exact second he realized he'd been deceived. The veil lifted. Cool air kissed her scarred cheek, and she heard Cale's sharp intake of breath, the kind of sound a man makes when he's been punched in the gut. "What?" he said, and his voice had lost all its smooth control, now edged with something dangerous and confused. "Who are you?" Seraphine forced her eyes open and looked up at her new husband for the first time, and the world tilted sideways because Kyle Raventhorn was staring at her with an expression that wasn't disgust or anger or even disappointment. It was something far more complicated and inexplicable. It was recognition, his dark eyes wide with shock as they traced every line of her face, like he was seeing a ghost made flesh. His hand came up as if moving independently from his body, and his fingers stopped just inches from her scar, hovering there in the space between them, trembling almost imperceptibly. And he whispered so quietly that only she could hear. "It's you. You're alive. But how is this possible?" The cathedral erupted in confused murmurs, 300 guests sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with the ceremony, and Seraphine stood frozen in her white dress, staring up at the stranger who somehow seemed to know her, who was looking at her like she was a miracle and a nightmare simultaneously. And she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about because she'd never met Cale Raventhorn before in her life. Or had she? Because why did something deep in her bones respond to the devastation in his eyes, like it recognized a pain that matched her own? Have you ever been mistaken for someone else at the worst possible moment? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's hear about your case of mistaken identity. You're absolutely right. I apologize for not following the word count instructions properly. Let me rewrite part 2 with the correct word count. Kyle's hand was still hovering near Seraphine's scarred face when Vincenzo Ashford rose from the front pew with the kind of deliberate movement that commanded attention. His silver-streaked hair perfectly combed back, his custom Italian suit unable to disguise the violence coiled beneath the civilized veneer. And he cleared his throat with enough authority to silence the rising whispers that had begun spreading through the cathedral like wildfire. "There's been a small change of plans," Vincenzo announced to the assembled guests, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man who'd spent decades lying to dangerous people and living to tell about it. "My daughter Isolde fell ill quite suddenly, so my younger daughter Seraphine has graciously agreed to fulfill the marriage contract in her stead. I'm sure the Raventhorn family understands that an Ashford is an Ashford, and the alliance remains intact." Seraphine watched her father deliver this performance with a sick fascination, because he made it sound like a choice she'd made, rather than an order she'd been given. Made it sound reasonable instead of what it actually was, which was a desperate scramble to save face and prevent a war, and she could feel Cale's body go absolutely still beside her, the kind of stillness that preceded either flight or violence. Kyle turned back to face her, and his dark eyes had transformed from shocked recognition to something harder and more controlled. The infamous Raventhorn composure sliding back into place like armor, but Seraphine could see the questions burning beneath that mask, could see the way his jaw clenched and released as he processed what her father had just revealed. "We'll discuss this later," Kyle said quietly, and though his words were ostensibly directed at Seraphine, his gaze flicked toward Vincenzo, with enough ice to freeze blood. Then he cupped Seraphine's scarred cheek with a gentleness that shocked her more than anger would have, and leaned down to press his lips against hers, in a kiss that should have been perfunctory, but instead felt like a brand, like a claim, like something that meant far more than a simple ceremony required. The kiss lasted only seconds, but Seraphine felt it in her entire body, a current of electricity that started where their lips met and radiated outward until her fingers tingled and her heart forgot its rhythm. And when Kyle pulled back, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and terrified, because nobody had ever looked at her like this. Like she mattered, like she was someone worth studying. The organ burst into processional music, and Kyle offered his arm to Seraphine with mechanical precision, and she placed her hand on his sleeve, feeling the solid muscle beneath the expensive fabric of his tuxedo as they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, walking down the aisle together through a gauntlet of curious and calculating stares from New York's criminal elite, all of them trying to determine what this last-minute substitution meant for the balance of power, all of them looking at her scar with varying degrees of poorly concealed surprise or disgust. Halfway down the aisle, Seraphine caught sight of a woman in the third row on the Raventhorn side, a striking figure with sharp cheekbones and platinum blonde hair cut in a severe bob, wearing a black dress to a wedding like she was attending a funeral. And the woman's ice blue eyes locked onto Seraphine with such naked hatred that Seraphine actually stumbled, her heel catching on the hem of her dress. Kyle's arm instantly wrapped around her waist, steadying her, pulling her closer against his side, and he murmured, "Don't let Lyra get to you. My cousin has always had a flair for the dramatic." She was hoping this alliance would fail, so the family would have an excuse for war. They emerged from the cathedral into afternoon sunshine, and a fleet of black cars waited at the curb, and Cale guided Seraphine toward the lead vehicle, a Rolls-Royce with windows tinted so dark they looked like portals to nowhere. And before they could reach it, a man appeared at Cale's elbow, tall and built like a boxer, with warm brown skin and kind eyes that seemed at odds with the gun holstered under his jacket. "Seraphine, this is Tobias, my head of security and the closest thing I have to a friend," Cale said. And there was something almost vulnerable in that admission, the idea that a Mafia boss would have only one friend. That power came with such profound isolation. "Tobias, my wife." And the word wife sounded strange in Cale's mouth, like he was testing out a foreign language. Tobias nodded respectfully at Seraphine, and she saw curiosity in his expression, rather than judgment. Saw him assess her the way a professional security expert would assess a new variable in his boss's life. Then he leaned close to Cale and whispered something that made her new husband's expression darken before disappearing into the crowd. Cale opened the Rolls-Royce door himself and handed Seraphine into the leather interior that smelled like luxury and danger, then slid in beside her and the door closed, sealing them into sudden intimate silence as the driver pulled away from the curb without needing to be told their destination. "Tell me about the accident," Kyle said suddenly, his voice gentler now. "The one that gave you the scar." Seraphine's hand moved instinctively to trace the familiar ridge of damaged tissue, and she wondered what he was looking for in her answer. "I was 7. My mother was driving us home from a piano recital. It was raining, and a truck ran a red light and hit us. My mother died instantly, and I woke up 3 days later with this," she said, gesturing to her scar, summarizing the moment that had split her life into before and after. Do you remember the hospital, the weeks after? Kyle pressed, shifting closer on the seat, his dark eyes searching her face. Seraphine frowned, pulling up memories she'd tried to forget. I remember it was cold and smelled like antiseptic. I remember my father standing in the doorway but never coming into the room. I remember a boy in a wheelchair when they were wheeling me to a scan. He had a bandaged head, and we looked at each other as we passed, and I remember thinking we matched, that we were both broken. Kyle made a choked sound and pushed back his hair to reveal a scar of his own, a pale line along his hairline. You told me we matched. I was being taken to surgery, and you smiled despite everything and said, we match now. And I spent 3 years thinking about that girl, wondering if she survived. The world contracted around Seraphine as she realized this impossible coincidence. You were the boy. What happened to you? Kyle's expression shuddered slightly, but he answered, car accident. Except mine wasn't an accident. It was the Cortez family trying to kill my father. They succeeded with him, but I survived. I was 9, and I inherited an empire built on blood. The confession hung between them, and Seraphine realized they were both children shaped by violence, both marked by the cruelty of the world they'd been born into. And maybe that was why he'd recognized her, because he recognized a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to carry scars that never fully healed. The Rolls-Royce pulled up to a mansion that looked more like a fortress, all stone and iron gates and security cameras that tracked their approach with mechanical precision, and Seraphine realized this was her home now, this intimidating structure that radiated power and danger. So different from her father's estate, with its false warmth and hidden rot. Kyle helped her out of the car, and they climbed steps to an entrance where 2 armed guards stood at attention, their eyes carefully averted, as if looking directly at the boss's new wife might result in their deaths. And inside the mansion was surprisingly beautiful, all dark wood and rich fabrics, art on the walls that Seraphine recognized as genuine Caravaggios and Vermeers, priceless pieces that belonged in museums, but instead hung in the private domain of a criminal king. The reception is scheduled to start in 2 hours at the Grandview Hotel, Kale said, checking his watch. Margot will show you to your rooms, so you can rest and change. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver hair appeared, wearing an elegant housekeeper's uniform. And she smiled at Seraphine with genuine warmth. Congratulations, Mrs. Raventhorn. And hearing that name made Seraphine's reality shift, because she was Mrs. Raventhorn now, legally bound to a man she'd met hours ago. The suite Margot led her to was massive, all soft grays and silvers with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, and there was a wedding dress laid out on the 4-poster bed, a fitted silver gown that looked like liquid mercury. Mr. Raventhorn had this made for Miss Isolde, Margot said diplomatically, but I'm handy with alterations if needed. And she helped Seraphine out of her cathedral dress with gentle efficiency until Seraphine stood in her simple slip, feeling vulnerable and exposed. You have beautiful bone structure, Margot said as she held up the silver dress. And that scar gives you character, makes you look like a warrior. Mr. Raventhorn needs a warrior, not a porcelain doll. And the unexpected kindness made Seraphine's eyes prick with tears. She had to blink back furiously. The silver dress fit better than expected. And when Seraphine looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This creature who looked almost beautiful in the way the dress caught light. And a knock on the door preceded Kale entering without waiting for permission, changed into a charcoal suit that made him look less like a groom and more like what he actually was, one of the most dangerous men in New York. We need to talk, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't optional, and Margot excused herself quickly, recognizing when her boss was about to discuss things that could get people killed. Kyle moved to the windows with his hands in his pockets, shoulders tight with tension. Tobias just informed me there's been chatter on our networks. The Cortez family knows about the wedding, and they're not happy about our alliance. There's a credible threat against the reception tonight. I'm doubling security, but I need you to stay close to me. If shooting starts, you drop to the ground and wait for Tobias or me to get you out. Understand? Seraphine felt ice flood her veins. Because this was real, people might try to kill her simply because of who she'd married, because she was a symbol of an alliance that threatened their power. Why not just cancel the reception? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. And Kyle turned from the window, crossing the room until he stood close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something dark and expensive. Because canceling shows weakness, and weakness gets you killed in this world, he said quietly. And despite the fact that our marriage is based on deception, you're still my wife now, and I protect what's mine. The possessiveness should have frightened her, but instead sent a shiver down her spine that had everything to do with the way his dark eyes held hers, the way his presence seemed to fill empty spaces inside her. I didn't ask for this, Seraphine said, needing him to understand she was as much a victim as he was. I didn't ask to replace my sister, or marry a stranger, or become a target. And Kyle's hand came up to cup her scarred cheek, his thumb tracing the rich tissue with devastating gentleness. I know, he said, something raw in his voice. But we're both trapped now. And I'd rather be trapped with the girl who smiled at me in a hospital and told me we matched than with some stranger raised to be a beautiful accessory. At least you're real. Before Seraphine could respond, his phone buzzed, and his expression darkened as he read the message. Tobias needs me. There's a situation, he said, already moving toward the door but pausing at the threshold. I meant what I said. Seraphine, stay close tonight. I've lost enough people to this life, and I'm not losing you too. Then he was gone, leaving her alone trying to steady her breathing, because everything was happening too fast. Her own phone buzzed in her clutch, and she pulled it out to find a text from an unknown number. And when she opened it, her blood turned to ice. You're not who he thinks you are. And when he finds out the truth about what your father did, this marriage will end in blood. Run while you still can. Seraphine stared at the threatening message until the words blurred, her mind racing through possibilities of what truth the sender could be referring to. What secret her father Vincenzo might be hiding that would be explosive enough to destroy her marriage before it even began. And she thought about all the conversations she'd overheard growing up in the Ashford household. All the late-night meetings in her father's study that she'd walked past on her way to the library. All the phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered a room. And she realized with creeping dread that her invisibility had perhaps allowed her to witness things that Isolde in all her pampered prominence had never seen. She took a screenshot of the message with trembling fingers, some instinct telling her she might need evidence later, then deleted the original text and blocked the number, though she knew that whoever had sent it could easily reach her again if they wanted to. And she felt the walls of her beautiful prison closing in because she was surrounded by enemies she couldn't identify and secrets she didn't understand. A soft knock on the door made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. And Margot entered carrying a jewelry box, her kind face creasing with concern when she saw Seraphine's pale expression. Are you all right, dear? Margot asked, setting down the box and moving closer with the instinctive nurturing of someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for others. You look like you've seen a ghost. Should I call Mr. Raventhorn? Seraphine shook her head quickly, because the last thing she needed was to appear weak or frightened when she was already the substitute bride, already the unexpected variable in Cale's carefully ordered world. I'm fine, just nervous about the reception, about meeting everyone properly, she lied, and Margot's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe it, but was too tactful to press. The Raventhorn family can be intimidating, Margot admitted, opening the jewelry box to reveal a stunning diamond necklace that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But Mr. Kale is a good man. Despite what the world thinks, he's had to make hard choices to survive and protect the people who depend on him, and he doesn't let many people close because everyone he's ever loved has been taken from him or betrayed him. So if he's chosen to protect you, that means something. The housekeeper fastened the necklace around Seraphine's throat, and the weight of it felt symbolic, like chains disguised as beauty. And Seraphine met her own eyes in the mirror, wondering who she was becoming. Whether she'd survive this world of violence and secrets intact, or whether it would break her into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The drive to the Grandview Hotel felt surreal. Seraphine sitting beside Kyle in the back of the Rolls-Royce with Tobias in the front passenger seat, and 2 security vehicles following behind. And she could feel the tension radiating from Kyle's body, even though his face remained impassive, could see the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings looking for threats. And she realized this was how he lived every moment of his life. Always waiting for the next attack, always prepared for a betrayal. "You look beautiful," Kyle said suddenly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. And when she turned to look at him, she found his dark eyes on her face, studying her with that same intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. "The silver brings out the gray in your eyes, makes them look like storm clouds." The unexpected compliment made heat rise in Seraphine's cheeks because no one had ever called her beautiful. No one had ever noticed the color of her eyes or cared enough to tell her, and she didn't know how to respond, so she just whispered, "Thank you," and looked down at her hands clasped in her lap. Kyle's hand covered hers, his fingers warm and strong, and he squeezed gently. "I know I haven't given you any choice in this. I know you're terrified and out of your depth, but I meant what I said earlier. You're mine to protect now, and I don't take that responsibility lightly. Whatever happens tonight or in the future, I won't let anyone hurt you." The promise settled over Seraphine like a blanket, comforting and suffocating in equal measure, because while part of her desperately wanted to believe him, another part whispered that he was making promises based on incomplete information, that when he discovered whatever truth her father was hiding, when he realized she came with secrets and complications beyond just being the substitute bride, his protection might evaporate like morning mist. The Grandview Hotel was lit up like a palace, all crystal chandeliers and gilded everything. And as they entered the ballroom, Seraphine was overwhelmed by the sheer opulence and the crowd of people who all turned to stare at them, their expressions ranging from curious to calculating to openly hostile. Kyle kept her close to his side, his hand on the small of her back possessive and reassuring, and he guided her through the room, introducing her to an endless parade of people whose names she immediately forgot. Crime bosses and their wives, politicians on the family payroll, business owners who laundered money through legitimate enterprises, all of them part of the vast network that kept the Raventhorn empire running. She shook hands and smiled until her face hurt, and tried not to flinch when people's eyes lingered too long on her scar, and she could hear the whispers following in their wake. People speculating about why Kyle had accepted the substitute bride, whether it was a sign of weakness or strategy, whether the alliance would hold or crumble. They were approaching the head table when Lyra appeared, Kale's cousin who'd worn black to the wedding, and up close, she was even more striking and intimidating, her ice-blue eyes sharp with intelligence and malice. "So this is the scarred little mouse who's replaced the beautiful Isolde," Lyra said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Tell me, Seraphine, how does it feel to know you're nothing but a placeholder, a political necessity that Kale will discard the moment a better option appears?" Seraphine felt the words like physical blows, but before she could formulate a response, Kyle stepped between them, his body language shifting into something dangerous. "Careful, Lyra," he said softly, and his voice carried enough threat to make several nearby conversations stop. "Seraphine is my wife, and therefore untouchable. If you disrespect her again, I'll interpret it as disrespect to me and the family, and you know what happens to family members who forget their place. Lyra's perfect face twisted with fury, but she backed down, disappearing into the crowd with a venomous look over her shoulder. And Kale turned to Seraphine with an expression that was almost apologetic. I'm sorry about her. She's always believed she should have a greater role in family leadership, and she resents anyone she perceives as competition, he explained, guiding Seraphine to their seats at the head table. And she wondered what it said about her new life that family members were as dangerous as outside enemies. The reception proceeded with speeches and toasts, and elaborate courses of food that Seraphine couldn't taste because her stomach was tied in knots. And she was hyper-aware of Kyle beside her, the heat of his body, and the way he periodically leaned close to explain who someone was, or to murmur some observation that made her feel like they were conspirators against the world. Tobias stood against the wall behind them, his eyes constantly scanning the room, and Seraphine noticed other security personnel stationed at every entrance, their presence a constant reminder that this celebration was also a potential battlefield. When it came time for the first dance, Kale led her onto the floor and pulled her into his arms, with a confidence that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. And Seraphine, who'd only ever practiced dance in the privacy of her room, tried not to step on his feet, as they moved to music that was too romantic for a marriage built on political necessity. Relax, Kyle murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her skin. Just follow my lead and trust me. And something about the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, made Seraphine's body soften against his, made her let him guide her through the steps until they were moving together like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. Why are you being so kind to me? Seraphine asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. You could have refused the marriage. Could have called off the alliance when you saw I wasn't Isolde. So why accept me? Kyle's arms tightened around her, and his dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because the moment I saw your face, I recognized something I thought I'd lost. Because that little girl in the hospital showed me kindness when I was terrified and alone, and I never forgot her. Because maybe this arranged marriage is the universe giving us a second chance at something neither of us knew we needed. And the raw honesty in his words made Seraphine's heart stutter, because this dangerous man was offering her something precious and fragile, something that could shatter under the weight of the secrets they both carried. The music swelled, and Kyle spun her in a move that made her silver dress flare out like wings. And for a moment, Seraphine forgot about the threats and the mysteries, and let herself feel like she was exactly where she belonged. But the moment ended abruptly when the lights went out, plunging the ballroom into absolute darkness filled with screams and the sound of chairs scraping and glass breaking. Kyle's body immediately covered hers, pushing her down to the floor beneath the protection of the table, his weight solid and shielding, and she heard him shouting orders to Tobias and the security team, heard gunshots that made her ears ring and her heart stop, and she realized with terrible clarity that the Cortez family had made good on their threat, that her wedding reception had become a war zone, and she was caught in the middle with no idea if she'd survive to see morning. The darkness was absolute and disorienting, filled with the chaos of panicked guests scrambling for exits and the sharp reports of gunfire that seemed to come from multiple directions. And Seraphine pressed herself against the cold marble floor while Kale's body covered hers like a human shield, his heart hammering against her back in a rhythm that matched her own terrified pulse. She could hear Tobias shouting coordinates to the security team, could hear the distinctive sound of returning fire as the Raventhorn guards engaged whoever had attacked, and she wondered with a detached clarity if this was how she would die, on her wedding night, beneath a table surrounded by strangers who saw her as nothing more than a political pawn. "Stay down and don't move," Kyle commanded, his voice hard and controlled despite the chaos. And then his weight lifted from her as he moved with lethal grace toward the sounds of combat. And Seraphine wanted to scream at him to come back, to stay safe. But the words caught in her throat because she had no right to demand anything from him. No right to care whether he lived or died when they'd known each other for less than a day. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the ballroom in an eerie red glow that made everything look like a scene from hell. And Seraphine could see overturned tables and abandoned champagne glasses, and people pressed against walls trying to make themselves smaller targets. And near the main entrance, she saw bodies on the ground, dark pools spreading beneath them, and her stomach lurched, because this was the reality of the world she'd married into. This violence and death and casual destruction of life. She heard a sound behind her, and turned to find Lyra crawling under the table. The cousin who'd been so hostile earlier now had her perfect hair disheveled and her black dress torn at the shoulder, and her ice blue eyes were wide, with something that looked like fear mixed with exhilaration. "This is your fault," Lyra hissed, her voice low and venomous. The Cortez family would never have attacked if Kyle had married Isolde as planned. They're sending a message that the alliance is weak because it's built on deception. And when this is over, Kale will realize you're more liability than asset, and he'll annul this joke of a marriage. Seraphine wanted to argue, but part of her feared Lyra was right, that she'd brought nothing but complications to Kale's life, that her presence had triggered this violence. And she felt shame and guilt twist in her chest, even as another part of her recognized that Lyra's timing was suspicious, that the cousin seemed less frightened than she should be for someone caught in an active shooting. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving a ringing silence broken only by whimpers from injured guests and the crunch of broken glass under boots as security personnel moved through the ballroom securing the space. And Seraphine heard Kale calling her name with an urgency that made her heart clench. She crawled out from under the table, ignoring Lyra's muttered curse, and stood on shaking legs to find Kale striding toward her with his gun still drawn and a streak of blood across his cheekbone that made her gasp. "Are you hurt?" they asked simultaneously. And despite everything, Seraphine felt a hysterical laugh bubble up, because here they were in the aftermath of an attack more concerned about each other than themselves. And Kyle's hands were on her face, her shoulders, her arms, checking for injuries with a thoroughness that spoke of genuine concern, rather than political necessity. "I'm fine," Seraphine assured him, then reached up to touch the blood on his face. "But you're not. You're bleeding." And Kale caught her hand, pressing her palm against his cheek in a gesture that felt intimate, despite their audience. "It's nothing. Just shrapnel from a ricochet," he said, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her forget they were standing in a war zone. "When the lights went out, all I could think about was getting to you, making sure you were safe. And I realized that somewhere between the cathedral and now you've become more than just a political arrangement to me. You've become someone I can't afford to lose." The confession hung between them raw and unexpected, and Seraphine felt something crack open in her chest. Because this dangerous man was offering her his truth, was admitting vulnerability in front of his people, and she wanted to tell him she felt the same inexplicable pull. But before she could speak, Tobias appeared at Kyle's elbow with an expression that made both of them tense. "We caught one of the shooters alive," Tobias said grimly. "And boss, you need to hear what he's saying, because it changes everything." Kale's jaw clenched, and he took Seraphine's hand, placing their fingers together in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "Whatever it is, she hears it too. No more secrets." And they followed Tobias through the devastated ballroom to a service corridor, where a man in black tactical gear was being held by 2 Raventhorn guards, blood streaming from his nose and his hands zip-tied behind his back. The man looked up as they approached, and Seraphine saw recognition flash in his eyes. followed by something that looked almost like pity, and her stomach dropped, because whatever he was about to say would be bad. She could feel it in the air like an approaching storm. "Tell them what you told me," Tobias ordered, and the captured shooter smiled through his bloody teeth, clearly enjoying the chaos he was about to unleash. "This wasn't a Cortez operation," the man said, his voice rough but steady. "We were hired by Vincenzo Ashford to stage an attack that would look like the Cortez family making a move. We were supposed to fire shots and cause panic, but avoid casualties. Make it look like the Alliance is under threat. So Cale Raventhorn would be forced to rely more heavily on Ashford resources and support. Except someone changed the plan at the last minute. Someone wanted real bodies to make it more convincing." The words hit Seraphine like physical blows, and she felt Cale's hand tighten around hers, almost painfully. Felt him turn to look at her with an expression that was transforming from shock to suspicion, and she shook her head desperately because she had no idea her father would do something this insane, this reckless. "You're lying," she said, her voice shaking. "My father wouldn't risk war with the Cortez family, wouldn't stage an attack on his own daughter." But even as she said it, she remembered all the times Vincenzo had looked at her with cold calculation, all the times he'd made it clear she was a tool rather than a person, and she felt certainty crumble beneath her feet. "Your father didn't know you'd be here," the shooter continued, clearly enjoying Seraphine's distress. "The plan was made when Isolde was still the bride, and Vincenzo figured his perfect daughter would be protected, while everyone else took the risk. But then Isolde ran, and he sent you instead. And I guess he decided one daughter was worth sacrificing, if it meant securing more power in the Alliance." Kyle released Seraphine's hand and stepped back, and the physical distance felt like a chasm opening between them, and she could see him reassessing everything. Could see the suspicion building in his dark eyes as he wondered if she'd known, if she was part of the deception. "I didn't know," Seraphine said desperately, reaching for him even as he moved further away. "I swear, I had no idea what he was planning. I'm just as much a victim here as you are." But she could see he didn't fully believe her. Could see the walls going up as he retreated behind the armor of the ruthless Mafia boss, who trusted no one. "Tobias, take this piece of trash to the warehouse and get everything he knows about Vincenzo's plan," Kyle ordered, his voice cold and empty of the warmth it had held minutes ago. "And get me a location on Vincenzo Ashford. We're going to have a conversation about the consequences of betraying the Raventhorn family." He turned back to Seraphine, and his expression was unreadable. "You're coming with me. Until I know the full extent of your involvement, you don't leave my sight. And if I find out you knew anything about this, alliance or not, there will be consequences." The threat was clear, and Seraphine felt tears burn her eyes because she'd been stupid to think that a few hours of connection could build real trust. Stupid to believe that Kyle's protection extended beyond political necessity. And she nodded mutely because what else could she do? She was trapped in a marriage to a man who now looked at her like she was the enemy, surrounded by a world that wanted to use her or destroy her. And the mysterious text from earlier suddenly made terrible sense because whoever had sent it had known this revelation was coming, had known that the truth about her father's machinations would shatter whatever fragile foundation she and Kyle had started building. What would you do if you discovered your family had betrayed the one person you were beginning to trust? Share your thoughts in the comments. The drive back to the Raventhorn mansion was suffocatingly silent. Kale staring out his window with his jaw clenched and his body radiating cold fury, while Seraphine sat on her side of the seat feeling the space between them like a physical wound. And she wanted to break the silence, to plead her innocence again. But she could see from the rigid set of his shoulders that nothing she said would penetrate the wall he'd erected between them. Tobias drove with his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, his expression sympathetic when he caught Seraphine's reflection. But he said nothing, because this wasn't his battle to fight. and the security vehicles flanking them felt less like protection now, and more like a prison escort. When they arrived at the mansion, Cale got out without waiting for her, striding toward the entrance with his phone already pressed to his ear, and Seraphine followed on unsteady legs, her beautiful silver dress now torn at the hem and stained with dirt from diving under tables. A perfect metaphor for how quickly her life had deteriorated from cautious hope to absolute disaster. Inside, Cale finally turned to face her, and his dark eyes were empty of the warmth she'd glimpsed earlier, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who'd been betrayed too many times to offer second chances easily. "Margot will show you to a guest room," he said, his voice flat. "You'll stay there until I've spoken with your father and determined the full extent of this situation. Tobias will post guards outside your door, for your protection, of course." But the way he said it made it clear she was a prisoner rather than a guest, that his trust in her had evaporated completely. "Cale, please," Seraphine started, but he held up a hand, cutting her off with a gesture that was both dismissive and final. "I don't want to hear it right now," he said, and there was something broken beneath his anger, something that sounded like disappointment or hurt. "I allowed myself to believe that maybe this marriage could be something real, that the girl from the hospital had grown into a woman I could trust. But clearly, I was a fool to think that any Ashford could be honest. Your whole family is built on lies and manipulation." The accusation stung, because it wasn't entirely unfair. Seraphine had grown up watching her father lie and scheme, had benefited from the blood money that paid for her education and her clothes, even if she'd never participated directly in the violence. And she felt shame burn through her because she was complicit by association, tainted by Vincenzo's sins, whether she'd known about the specific betrayal or not. Margot appeared and gently guided Seraphine up the stairs, and she looked back once to see Kyle standing in the foyer watching her go, with an expression that made her heart break, because she could see the exact moment he closed himself off completely, could see him retreat behind the armor that had kept him alive in this brutal world, and she knew that whatever fragile connection they'd built had been shattered beyond immediate repair. The guest room Margot led her to was beautiful, but impersonal, clearly designed for visitors rather than family, and the message was clear that Seraphine was no longer welcome in the suite she'd occupied earlier, no longer trusted to share Cale's space. "He'll calm down once he has all the facts," Margot said softly, helping Seraphine out of the ruined silver dress with gentle hands. "Mr. Cale has been hurt many times, and his first instinct is always to protect himself by pushing people away, but I saw how he looked at you tonight before the attack. That wasn't political strategy. That was a man starting to care." But her reassurances felt hollow when Seraphine could hear the guards taking position outside her door, when she was locked in a gilded cage by the man who hours ago had promised to protect her. Alone, Seraphine finally let the tears come, sobbing into the expensive pillows as the full weight of her situation crashed over her, because she was married to a man who now hated her, trapped in a world of violence she didn't understand, and her own father had orchestrated an attack that could have killed her, had deemed her expendable in his quest for power. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it desperately, hoping irrationally that it might be Kyle. But instead, it was another message from the unknown number. "I warned you to run. Now Kyle will never trust you, and your father will use you as a pawn until you're no longer useful. But I can help you if you're brave enough to learn the whole truth. Meet me at the gardens behind the East Wing at midnight. Come alone or not at all." Seraphine stared at the message, knowing it was likely a trap, knowing that sneaking out would only confirm Cale's suspicions that she was scheming against him. But the alternative was sitting in this room waiting for her fate to be decided by men who saw her as an object rather than a person. And she'd spent 23 years being invisible and powerless, and she was suddenly furious, suddenly desperate to take some control over her own life, even if it was dangerous. At 11:30, she changed into the simple black dress she found in the closet. And she opened her door to find two guards posted outside, just as Kale had promised. But they were facing outward, watching for external threats, rather than inward watching her. And she cleared her throat softly. "I need some air, just to walk to the bathroom down the hall," she said, trying to project innocence. And the guards exchanged glances before one nodded, "Make it quick, Mrs. Raventhorn." And she slipped past them, moving toward the bathroom, but then ducking into a side corridor she'd noticed when Margot had brought her upstairs, her heart hammering as she navigated through the unfamiliar mansion, using her memory of the view from her earlier suite to orient herself toward the east wing. She found a service staircase that led down to a door opening onto the gardens, and the cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, and she could see a figure waiting by a fountain, silhouetted against the moonlight. And as she got closer, the figure turned, and Seraphine gasped, because it was Lyra, Kale's cousin who'd been so hostile, the woman who'd worn black to her wedding, like she was mourning. "I knew you'd come," Lyra said, and her ice blue eyes gleamed with something calculating. "You're desperate enough to take risks now. Desperate enough to hear the truth that everyone has been hiding from you." Seraphine's first instinct was to run back to the mansion, because Lyra had shown nothing but hostility since the cathedral. But something in the other woman's expression stopped her, a kind of grim sincerity that suggested whatever she was about to reveal was important enough to risk this midnight meeting. "Why are you helping me?" Seraphine asked, staying several feet back, ready to flee if this turned into a trap. And Lyra laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "I'm not helping you. I'm helping Kale, even though he's too stupid to see that he needs it," Lyra said, crossing her arms. "I've hated every woman he's ever looked at, because none of them were good enough. They were all social climbers or spies or worse. But you're different. I saw how he looked at you tonight, and I haven't seen him that unguarded since before his father died. And despite myself, I want him to have something real, even if it complicates my own ambitions." She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen, then turned it toward Seraphine, showing a series of photographs. And Seraphine squinted in the moonlight, trying to make out the images, then gasped as she recognized her father, Vincenzo, meeting with a man she didn't know, timestamps showing the meetings had occurred over the past 6 months. "That's Dante Cortez," Lyra explained, "head of the family that's supposedly your father's enemy. Except they've been meeting secretly for half a year. And I have recordings of their conversations where they discuss using the marriage alliance to position themselves to eventually take over both the Ashford and Raventhorn territories. They plan to let you and Kyle build trust and stage incidents that would turn you against each other, weakening both families from within." Seraphine felt sick as the pieces clicked into place, the mysterious text warning her, the convenient attack at the reception, her father's willingness to send her into danger. It was all part of a larger scheme to destroy Kyle from the inside. "Why didn't you tell Kyle this before?" she demanded, and Lyra's expression turned sad. "Because I only got the final proof tonight, and because Kyle doesn't trust easily. He'd assume I was manipulating him for my own gain. But you can show him the truth. You can prove your innocence and expose your father's real plan," Lyra said, then added quietly, "And because I saw you tonight. Saw you scared but brave. Saw you look at my cousin like he's a person instead of a weapon. And I think maybe you're exactly what he needs to remember he's human." Seraphine took the phone with shaking hands, scrolling through the evidence that would condemn her father but save her marriage. And she felt something shift inside her, a core of steel forming where there had been only doubt. Because she was done being a pawn in men's games, done letting others control her fate. "Help me get this to Kale," she said, meeting Lyra's ice blue eyes with new determination. "And then help me make my father pay for every lie." Lyra led Seraphine back through the mansion, using servants' passages that bypassed the guards, moving through the shadows with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in this world of secrets and strategies. And they found Cale in his study, a room dominated by dark wood and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and he was standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at nothing. "Cale, you need to see this," Lyra announced, and he turned with his expression hardening when he saw Seraphine, clearly prepared to order her back to her room. But Lyra stepped between them with uncharacteristic protectiveness. "Before you go full Ice King on your wife, look at what she risked her safety to bring you. Look at the evidence that proves she's been as much a victim of Vincenzo's schemes as you have." She thrust her phone toward him, and Kyle took it with obvious reluctance. But as he scrolled through the photographs and started playing the audio recordings, his expression transformed from cold anger to shock, to a fury so intense that Seraphine instinctively stepped back. "Vincenzo has been working with Dante Cortez for 6 months, Kyle said, his voice deadly quiet. "They plan to use the marriage alliance as a weapon, plan to destroy both our families from within, and divide the territory between themselves. And tonight's attack was just the opening move." He looked up at Seraphine, and she saw the exact moment his suspicion crumbled, saw guilt flash across his features as he realized he'd blamed her for sins that weren't hers, that she'd been a pawn, just like him. "I'm sorry," he said, crossing the room to cup her face with his free hand, his thumb gentle against her scarred cheek. "I should have trusted you. Should have known that the girl who smiled at me in a hospital wouldn't grow up to be someone cruel. But I've been betrayed so many times that my first instinct is always to assume the worst." Seraphine covered his hand with hers, feeling tears prick her eyes because this was what she'd needed. This acknowledgement that she was worthy of trust, that her innocence mattered. "I understand why you doubted me," she said softly. "But Kyle, my father tried to have us killed, tried to use me as a disposable piece in his game, and I can't let that stand. I need to be part of whatever you're planning. I need to prove that I'm choosing you over the family that never wanted me." Kyle's dark eyes searched hers, and she saw something ignite in their depths, saw him recognize the steel that had formed in her spine during their hours apart, and he nodded slowly. "Then we do this together?" he said, then turned to Lyra with an expression of grudging respect. "Thank you, cousin. I know gathering this evidence put you at risk, and I won't forget that you chose family loyalty over your usual tendency toward chaos." Lyra smirked. "Don't get sentimental on me. I just didn't want to watch you mope around being miserable when you finally found someone who looks at you like you're worth saving. Now can we please focus on destroying the men who thought they could manipulate the Raventhorn family?" Cale made a series of phone calls, his voice crisp and commanding as he mobilized his organization, and within an hour, the study was filled with his top lieutenants, including Tobias, who'd brought the captured shooter from earlier, and Kyle played the recordings of Vincenzo and Dante plotting their takeover, while Seraphine stood beside him, feeling like she was finally being treated as a partner rather than a possession. "Here's what's going to happen," Kyle announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who'd commanded empires since childhood. "Vincenzo thinks we're fractured and vulnerable, thinks his daughter is locked away in disgrace, and that I'm planning revenge against the Ashford family. So we're going to use that assumption against him. Seraphine is going to call her father and tell him she has information about Raventhorn's security weaknesses. Tell him she wants to help him, because I've rejected her, and we're going to feed him a location where he thinks he can strike at me while I'm vulnerable." Seraphine felt her heart race, because this plan required her to face Vincenzo directly, to lie to the man who'd raised her, even if he'd never truly loved her. But she also felt a fierce satisfaction, because finally she was taking action. Finally she had agency in her own story. "What if he doesn't believe me?" she asked, and Kyle's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that had become familiar, despite the short time they'd known each other. He'll believe you, because he's always underestimated you. Always seen you as weak and scarred and desperate for approval. He won't be able to imagine that you've found the strength to stand against him," Kyle said, and there was pride in his voice that made Seraphine's chest warm. "But I'll be with you every step of the way. You won't face him alone." They spent the next 2 hours planning every detail, and Seraphine called her father at 3 in the morning, her voice shaking with manufactured tears as she told him that Kyle had locked her away and blamed her for the attack, that she'd overheard his guards discussing a meeting at the old waterfront warehouse the following night, that Kyle would be there with minimal security to negotiate with a weapons supplier. Vincenzo's voice had been smooth and pleased, as he praised her for being smart enough to see where her true loyalties should lie. And Seraphine had felt sick hearing his manipulation, but she'd played her part perfectly, and when she ended the call, Kale had pulled her into his arms and held her while she shook with reaction. The next night found them at the waterfront warehouse, and it was actually one of Kyle's properties, so they controlled every entrance and exit, and Seraphine wore a wire, while Kyle's entire security force waited hidden in the shadows. And when Vincenzo arrived with 12 armed men and Dante Cortez at his side, Seraphine stepped out of the shadows to face them. "Hello, father," she said, and Vincenzo smiled at her like she was a faithful dog returning to heel, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him. "I knew you'd see reason eventually," Vincenzo said. "The Raventhorns are finished, and you're smart enough to choose the winning side. Now where is Kyle?" Seraphine let herself smile, cold and fierce. "Right behind you," and lights flooded the warehouse as Kyle emerged with Tobias and 50 armed men, and Vincenzo's expression transformed from smug satisfaction to shock as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "You think you can betray my family and live?" Kyle asked, his voice carrying death in every syllable. "You think you can plan my destruction and face no consequences?" He played the recordings on a speaker system, so everyone could hear Vincenzo and Dante plotting, could hear them laugh about manipulating their own children, and Seraphine watched her father's face pale as his schemes were exposed. "The heads of the 5 families are listening to this right now," Kyle continued, "and they've already voted. You're stripped of your territory and your title, Vincenzo. The Ashford family will be absorbed into the Raventhorn Empire, and you and Dante will answer for your treason according to the old laws." Vincenzo looked at Seraphine with hatred now, all pretense of paternal affection gone. "You stupid, scarred bitch. You've destroyed everything." And before anyone could react, Seraphine stepped forward and slapped him across the face with all the strength of 23 years of being invisible and unloved. "No, father. I've freed myself from you, and I choose Kale. I choose a man who sees my scars and calls me beautiful over a father who looked away from me my entire life." And Kyle's hand was on her shoulder, warm and solid and proud, and she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. 3 months later, Seraphine stood in the gardens of the Raventhorn mansion, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and she felt a peace she'd never known in her 23 years, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with choice. The aftermath of that night at the warehouse had been complicated. Vincenzo had been exiled from New York with nothing but his life, a mercy Seraphine had requested, despite everything, because she refused to become the kind of person who ordered her father's death, even if he deserved it. And Dante Cortez had faced the old laws and paid with his blood for his treason. The Ashford territory had been absorbed into the Raventhorn Empire as promised, but Kyle had surprised everyone by appointing Seraphine as his administrator, trusting her to rebuild what her father had corrupted, and she'd thrown herself into the work with a passion she hadn't known she possessed, rooting out the most brutal operations and redirecting resources toward legitimate businesses. Isolde had reached out once, a tentative email asking if Seraphine was all right, and they'd met for coffee in a neutral location where her older sister had apologized for running, for leaving Seraphine to face consequences that should have been hers. But Seraphine had surprised them both by thanking her, because if Isolde hadn't run, Seraphine would never have found Kael, would never have discovered her own strength. She heard footsteps behind her and smiled before turning because she'd learned to recognize Kael's approach. The measured, confident stride of a man who ruled an empire, but came home to her every night, and his arms wrapped around her waist as he pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, and Seraphine covered his hands with hers, marveling at how natural this had become, how the stranger from the cathedral had transformed into the person who knew her better than anyone. "I'm thinking about how 3 months ago I was invisible and terrified, and now I'm someone who matters, someone who makes decisions that affect thousands of people. And it's terrifying, but also exhilarating," she said, turning in his arms to face him. And the way he looked at her still made her breath catch, like she was the most precious thing in his world. "You were always someone who mattered," Kael said, his hand coming up to trace her scar the way he did every day, his touch reverent rather than pitying. "You just needed someone to see you, and I'm grateful every day that I got to be the person that the universe gave us back to each other." He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise. And when they broke apart, Seraphine saw her future reflected in his dark eyes, saw years of partnership and passion, and the kind of love that was built on choice rather than obligation, on trust earned rather than assumed. "I have something for you," Kael said, pulling a small box from his pocket. And when he opened it, Seraphine saw a ring, not the large, ostentatious diamond that had been part of her wedding set, but a delicate band with a small stone that looked like a star. "This was my mother's," he explained. "She died when I was young, but I remember she used to say that scars were just proof that we survived something that tried to break us, that they made us beautiful in ways smooth skin never could. And I think she would have loved you, would have recognized your strength." Seraphine felt tears blur her vision as he slipped the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band, felt the weight of being chosen not for politics, but for love. And she pulled him down for another kiss that tasted like gratitude and joy and new beginnings. What's your definition of true strength? Drop your thoughts below. We'd love to hear how you found your own power. In the distance, Margot watched from the kitchen window and smiled. And Tobias collected money from Lyra, who'd bet that it would take 6 months for Kael to give Seraphine the family ring instead of 3, and the Raventhorn mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a home, because the scarred bride and the damaged boss had found in each other exactly what they needed. Proof that sometimes the worst circumstances could lead to the most beautiful destinations. That scars matched in a hospital hallway could become the foundation for an empire built on love instead of fear, and that choosing each other every day was the most powerful alliance of all.